Hello, I'm Annie Graham Larkin, Executive Director of the Bisbee Mining and Historical Museum. Welcome to Bisbee Noir with Tom Vaughan. Thank you to our program sponsor, the Arizona Historical Society, as well as our members and donors who enable the museum to provide free online programming and to fulfill the organization's mission to discover history, explore Bisbee's past today. To learn how you can assist the museum in supporting its mission and programs by becoming a member or donor, please visit bisbeemuseum.org. On Saturday, October 5th at 11 a.m., the museum will host the free online program Buffalo Soldiers and Bonita Canyon with historian Sharon Kennedy. To register or for more information, visit the Bisbee Mining and Historical Museum's Facebook page. And today and every Saturday at 2 p.m., the Bisbee Mining and Historical Museum offers the Stepping Back in Time walking tour with former museum curator Boyd Nickel. During this 1-hour walking tour of the historic district, you'll learn about the mining camp's rich history. Spaces are limited and reservations are recommended. To reserve your space, visit bisbeemuseum.org. All right. Born in Flint, Michigan, Tom Vaughan studied photography in Northern California and Tucson, Arizona. Vaughan moved to Bisbee in 1977 and soon began work at the Bisbee Mining and Historical Museum, where he was curator, archivist, and director. While at the museum, he wrote and presented talks on photographic preservation, conservation, and history, as well as built exhibits and participated in the Bisbee Council on the Arts Nation-to-Nation celebration. He currently resides in Fort Collins, Colorado. And if you would like to ask Tom questions during his presentation today, please type your questions in the Q&A chat box, and we'll gather those and share with Tom at the end of the presentation. And also a link to today's recording will be sent to all of our Zoom registrants later today. And with that, I'd like to welcome Tom Vaughan. Thank you for joining us today, Tom.
Thank you for having me, Annie.
All right, let's get your PowerPoint all up for you.
Okay. Well, Bisbee, Arizona is located about 90 miles southeast of Tucson, Arizona, about within 10 miles of the Mexican border. Uh-oh, it's going fast here. Can I go back a slide? That first slide showed an 1864 military map of our part of the country, and it showed that there was no, it was all called Apacheria. Here we have another sketch of the mountains, and one early writer wrote that the mountains were a natural fortress cut by canyons, washes, clear streams, brooks, and towering rock parapets, populated by bear, deer, wild pig, and mountain lions, festoons with vines of grape, deep wooded canyons, glens of sycamore, walnut, willows, and manzanita bushes. Cool splashing water streams gurgled musically. Blue jays, wild canaries, linnets, and mockingbirds darted about the clean air and the refreshing forests, with only Apaches passing through. So the Apaches used these mountains for hunting, and also they drove their stolen mules up into the canyons and then barricaded the canyons with brush and tree branches, and therefore corralled their mules. Possibly the name Mule Mountains comes from that. Next. Can we have the next slide, please? Jack Dunn on the left and his wife Mary was the first person to file a mining claim in the Mule Mountains. Dunn was scouting with the cavalry into the mountains when he found some float, and then made a mining claim and became the first man. Dunn's son and Judge Duncan are responsible for the myths that continued about the next man into the mountains, which was George Warren. Next. George came into the mountains a few times, but the first recorded time we have of George was coming across from the Silver City. George had been in the Silver City area of Ralston, Fort Grant, and Silver City, filing mining claims from 1870 on. He came across in 1877, in about February of 1877, with 3 other men in a wagon. They stopped at Fort Bowie, but everyone was out scouting or patrolling for Apaches. And so he continued on to the San Pedro River, where they hid their wagon near the river, and 2 men stayed there to guard the wagon as George and D.B. Ray headed upstream and then came to the area about where San Jose is today. There they encountered a lot of sign of Apache, and George and Ray headed back to their wagon and then back to Silver City without being able to get into the Mule Mountains. George next came in September of 1877, this time with a bunch of men from Silver City area who he had been mining with and witnessing mining claims with and so on. There's about 8 of them, and they're all from the Silver City area. Now, the myth is that Jack Dunn provided Warren with mules and sent him to the Mule Mountains, and then George got drunk and so on. But that did not happen. George came across with about 8 other miners and prospectors. They stopped at Fort Bowie once again in late 1877, couldn't get any assistance there, and went on to Camp Huachuca. There, General Whitside accompanied George with troopers into the Mule Mountains, and George and his prospector buddies filed mining claims in the Mule Mountains. Next. Whoops, 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 whoops. Can we go back? Whoa, 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 whoa. Something's happening here.
I can get it for you, Tom.
I'd like to go back.
Okay, no problem. Let me stop the remote control and I will go back for you.
Okay. Thank you.
There you go.
There you go. So George is the prospector on the state seal of Arizona in 1912 when Arizona became a state. And he is the father of our mining camp. George filed a lot of claims, headed into Mexico many times, but always more or less threw his money away, often by being in saloons. But one observer said George came out of a saloon one day and just grabbed his money out of his pocket and threw it out in the street and watched people die for his money. He always seemed to be a jovial guy. People liked to have him around, liked to see him in the camp. Next. Next, there we go. Here's George in 1889 at a 4th of July celebration in Bisbee. This photograph is courtesy of the Bisbee Restoration Museum on Main Street in Bisbee. Most of the other photographs are from the Bisbee Mining and Historical Museum. Next. I don't know how we're doing it. There we go. Now we're going to jump to 1903. This is the interior of the Orient Saloon in Bisbee, the premier gambling house of Bisbee, in a period when almost all the buildings on Main Street were saloons, or at least every other one were saloons. This classical photograph is amazing for a lot of different reasons, but the classical, it's just got a wonderful lighting. The setup is fantastic. And all of these people are gamblers and saloon owners and other hangers-on to the gambling in Bisbee. This is Anthony Tony Downs, one of the owners, and by the way, a relative of Annie Larkin. Down here we have Jack Ganshorn. He wrote a book called I've Killed Men. And here we have Doyle. I don't know his first name, but he was a concert hall singer. I'd like to note all the hats here. They're primarily derby. Derby hat was very popular at the time. This plug hat on the right is actually an old-fashioned hat for that time period, but you'll see it used. Next. So this photograph was used for Cyrus Noble Whiskey, created a poster from our photograph, but you notice that the graphic artist probably did not consider it Western enough, so he changed the clothing on two of the men at least. So instead of fine suits that the gamblers had, he made it look sort of like a cowboy and changed their clothing altogether. And the hats, fewer derbies, there's one here, but there's fewer derbies. And so you can see that also up here, they put a Cyrus Noble Whiskey poster. So that was a commercial photograph. But Irwin went on to make two other photographs in the Orient Saloon that day. Next. This is the crap table of the Orient Saloon. And two of the men here, that's Johnny Irwin, that's his brother Marvin Irwin. Marvin went on to become a photographer in Douglas, and Johnny continued to be a gambler, and he was well known throughout the West and lived in a penthouse in Las Vegas. Also note the leaded and stained glass windows here at the saloon entrance. Next. The roulette table at the Orient Saloon. Roulette was a popular sport, a gambling game, but also they often put it near the front door because it's so colorful, red and black, and it was spinning white ball and so on. So when you walk by from your drab work, perhaps in the mine where everything is sort of gray, you look into the saloon, brightly lit. You can see the lights all around here, and also this very colorful roulette wheel. It was so colorful, in fact, one losing gambler at the Maze Saloon on Main Street grabbed the roulette wheel and tried to cart it off. He was caught in the middle of Main Street and arrested. The wheel returned. Next. So you can see what Main Street looked like in about that time period. And of course, here's the Orient Saloon sign. You can see there's wooden buildings all up and down Main Street, and many of them are saloons and other businesses. And this was about to change, however. So here's the Orient, just one long wooden building, although the inside looked more grand than that. Next. The Orient's competitor across the street was the Turf Saloon, and it also had a lot of gambling, and the Turf was run by Letson and ended up being one of the oldest saloons on Main Street. And you can see again, when the men went out, they dressed with sport jackets and suits. Next. And here we have a tug-of-war contest. Now, tug-of-war contest of 1903 was much different than the one we know today. Today, you might have college students pulling each other across a creek or a muddy area. A tug-of-war that'll last maybe about 20 minutes. But the tug-of-war in that time period, here you see the men down here, they laid on a ladder-like structure and had rungs down here, and they pulled themselves back and forth. But the contest could last up to 3 hours. In the book, I report on a contest that lasted over 2 hours at the packed Opera House. Over $5,000 was wagered in private betting booths. Cleat by cleat, the losers were finally dragged across the finish line. The iconic and famous bear story of Brewery Gulch. We have Joseph Muheim. This bear was brought to him as a cub, and he used to keep it chained to a tree outside and back, and the miners would come in, and sometimes the bear would join them in the saloon. They would feed it beer. One evening, after many rounds of beer, the bear was taken back to his tree and chained up, and he fell from the tree and hung himself. Next. Here's a typical Bisbee saloon. And you can see back here, there's a skylight, but there's also a pool table back here, one table, and just a very plain place with posters on the wall and a clock, flag, and so on. Very plain for most of them. Next. This is Brewery Gulch in about 1906. Here's the brewery building. But a Tucson reporter wrote, "The street is somewhat frightful from a sanitary point of view. Slime, offal, tobacco juice, and alcohol collected near the saloon door. It was covered with slime several inches deep and about 4 feet wide, from which comes a nauseating odor. It remains a disgrace to the city. You smell it when you step off the train. Its vile odor is still in the nostrils when you have traveled far from the city, out on the cool and refreshing plains where Don Luis and Naco lie in the breeze. Women in their long skirts had negotiated the streets because of slime, tobacco juice, and alcohol accumulating near the saloon doors." Next. So you had that on the streets, but in the air, the smelter was still in Bisbee. It created its own air problems. Next. This photograph by Frederick Ransom for his 1904 publication of Geology and Ore Deposits of Bisbee Quadrangle shows what Bisbee looked like at that time period. A Bisbee correspondent in the Arizona Daily Star wrote, "A duty of officials and foremen are hired to keep their mouths tightly closed, presumably as a precaution against the sulfur-laden atmosphere which pervades Bisbee." Next. So Bisbee's period of growth is from 1900 to about 1910. These are two Sanborn maps. This one on the left is 1900. It's color-coded. You can see the red is brick, yellow is lumber or wood, and then the gray is stone. And then notice in this period, Brewery Gulch doesn't have any brick buildings. Here's the museum building, by the way, and there's the Copper Queen Hotel imprint. It hasn't quite been built, and there's a school. And then in 1908, you look at the burst of energy of growth that happened, and all these brick buildings appeared on Brewery Gulch, most of them built by saloon money, including Curator, Shattuck, Muheim, Medikovich, and others put money into these brick buildings, and it really prospered during this time. It's a real spurt of growth. Next. Here's a closer view of that. In this time period, there's probably about 20 saloons in Brewery Gulch, and I would say that is the epigee of the saloon life in Brewery Gulch. And over here is Central School, and of course the museum building and the hotel. Next. Next. And here's what Bisbee looked like in that time period. It's really, really rocking. Here we have a passenger train here. We have ore trains and freight trains. A little bit of the, by now, the smelter has been removed from Bisbee out onto the plains of what is to become Douglas. Copper Queen Hotel and the museum. Whoa. I don't know where that came from. Next. Wow, that's way too far. I don't know what happened here, why that's happening. But anyway, here's 1907. Gambling is outlawed in the territory of Arizona. That's April 1st, 1907. So that begins, once the city council came in 1902, all kinds of ordinances were brought about for saloons. And 1907 stops gambling. Next. And here's a humorous photograph, or an attempt at humor anyway, for the last night of gambling in Bisbee. You see he has a card up here. This is, by the way, is Sheriff Bauer. He is the sheriff. He's got a gun. There's a lot more chips than there would ever be in a poker game, and all these people are around the table. This is the last night of gambling in Bisbee. Next. Okay, this is about a 1906 photograph of Bisbee, and you can see that most of the wood buildings are here. This is St. Elmo, which started on Main Street in 1903. The Anchor Saloon next to it, other saloons on down the line, and you can see that they're still mostly wooden buildings. This is the old fire station, which is next to what is today the Bank of Bisbee. Next. I apologize for the quality of this photograph, but you can see by this time period in 1906 or 7, you have the expansion of the Bank of Bisbee, and all kinds of brick buildings were going in on Main Street, including 4 banks, a jewelry store, the fair, which is the Restoration Museum, and others. So many, many brick buildings going on Main Street. It began driving the saloons out of Main Street. And so most of the saloons went to either Brewery Gulch or to Lowell. By this time, there was a limit on the amount of saloon licenses that Bisbee offered. So saloons often packed up and moved to Lowell. Next. This is on Main Street, right just west of the library post office building. And this is called the Office Saloon. And this was an attempt to draw businessmen into the saloon and not make it a dive, but make it sort of a luxurious place. You can see, of course, the spittoons over here and all the alcohol and lots of lights all over the place. Electricity was king in those days, and the cigars here in front. But over on the right, you have private booths. So you could go into these booths and have privacy and conduct business deals and so on. And there was buzzers in the saloon so you could ring for your drinks. So this was an attempt to make a classic saloon on Main Street. Next. So more regulation for saloons in 1910. Saloons were not allowed in the red light district further up Brewery Gulch. So a lot of the dives and dance halls up there went out of business. You had to close from midnight to 6 o'clock. Prior to 1910, Bisbee saloons stayed open 24 hours a day. But this era of Reformation came about, and now the saloons were closed from midnight to 6 a.m., which drove other saloons out of business. By the way, the Orient went out of business in 1907 when gambling was forbidden. But other saloons now, because of the limited amount of licenses and so on, were driven to go to Lowell, which was an unincorporated area down about a mile or so from Bisbee. Next. And here's Lowell about that time period. Lowell was unincorporated, did not have regulations other than the state regulations for saloons, and women were allowed in saloons. So many of the prostitutes and other people in the red light district, gamblers and pimps, moved down to Lowell. Next. Here's a 1908 photograph of Lowell with election day. But again, we have a crowded streets. People from all the area came to Lowell, and that was a voting precinct. But it really siphoned off a lot of the saloons from Bisbee at that time. Next. And saloon tokens. So you went to buy a drink in a saloon, and they could possibly, instead of giving you 10 cents back, for instance, they could give you a 12.5-cent saloon token, which was a little extra money, but you had to return to that saloon in order to spend it. Here we have the Antlers, we have the Butte Saloon, we have the St. Louis Beer Hall, here's the Office Saloon. So most of the saloons and some other businesses use tokens for change, which guaranteed your return to buy another beer. Next. Saloon owners' children were often sent to college. They went to Ivy League schools, they went to California, they went to St. Louis. This is the Tolles sister. Here's Miriam and Elsie. Miriam and Elsie both graduated from Bisbee High School, and they went on to the University of Michigan, where they got their bachelor's degree. They returned briefly, and then Elsie went off to Berkeley in California and got her master's degree. Then she returned to Cochise County and was the first woman county superintendent of schools. Muheim, Coretto, Shattuck, a lot of the saloon owners sent their children off to universities throughout the United States. Most of them, of course, didn't return. They became doctors, lawyers, and other things, but that was saloon money. Next. Most of the mining company officials didn't spend a lot of time in Bisbee saloons. In 1907, we have the Country Club. The Country Club had banquets, parties. They also had a tennis court, golf course, a rifle range. And so most of Bisbee's mining engineers and other hierarchy from the mining companies spent their social hours here. Next. Here are some of them casually sitting on the porch of the Bisbee Country Club. This is not to be mistaken with the most recent country club. This country club is out by the airport south of Warren. But here they are relaxing on the porch in various casual dress. They did, however, have a dog fights at their, excuse me. Okay. Well, anyway, they did have dog fights at the country club, and Sheriff Wheeler busted the country club one time for dog fights. So January 1st, 1915, Arizona enacted prohibition. And this is the Bisbee Daily Review. John Barleycorn makes his final bow to newest Arizona. People came over from Fort Huachuca. The whole town was just rocking with people for the last night of drinking, but no fights broke out. It was very peaceful. The fraternal organizations threw their spiked punch out the window and put in ice water. So Arizona has now become dry. Next. And here is St. Elmo Saloon, formerly saloon, now an ice cream parlor as a result of Prohibition. So it's no longer alcohol on Brewery Gulch. Next. And Sheriff Wheeler was chasing bootleggers all over the county because the neighboring states were not dry in 1915. So alcohol came in from New Mexico and Texas, Kansas, other places. And that just meant that Sheriff Wheeler was trying to arrest bootleggers all over the place. But the bootleggers would watch wherever Wheeler was going, and then they would come in from the other direction. He was having a heck of a time. He did bust a lot of people. Then the next thing that happened, however, even though there was prohibition in Arizona, and you could not buy or sell alcohol in 1915, it was decided that you could drink alcohol, you could consume alcohol. So people started buying alcohol. Next. There was advertisements from El Paso, from Kansas, from other places in the newspaper. There were flyers put in people's post office box. You could buy cases of alcohol and have it shipped in on the train. So it upset Wheeler and it upset the bootleggers. Next. Here's another advertisement in the Bisbee Review. To deliver beer and whiskey ordered from Schiller Brothers, Tiffany Club Whiskey. So you could order your alcohol in 1915 and have it shipped into the train, and the train station on the day of the shipment would be very, very crowded in Bisbee. Next. Well, the arrival of the wet goods, as it says, and this headline says, to the despair of bootleggers. Bootleggers and Sheriff Wheeler were both very upset about this personal use idea. Wheeler, because he was trying to catch bootleggers and the people were drinking, and the bootleggers because they were losing their customers. In fact, in the newspaper, bootleggers were reported to have said that they thought it was very unfair. One prominent bootlegger of Bisbee was quoted in the press. He said, the people of the great state of Arizona voted at the last election that it should be illegal to bring whiskey into the state. And I think it's an outrage when these three men on the Supreme Court can allow drinking. Well, that lasted for part of the year, the personal use idea. But then the Supreme Court reversed itself. And next, again, we have Wheeler getting back to busting bootleggers and the bootleggers themselves providing alcohol to everyone. One amazing thing was the Bisbee Evening Or once complained in the newspaper. It said, we wish the bootleggers would not park their automobiles in front of our newspaper office. It is demeaning to our employees. Next. So you couldn't drink, you could, there couldn't be a saloon on Main Street, there couldn't be any alcohol on Main Street. But one thing Main Street had was a bomb making factory. Yes, a bomb making factory. These are bombs to be made to use in the Mexican Revolution and then be tossed out of airplanes. And this is a plumbing company on Main Street that was making bombs. So you could not drink, but you could make bombs on Main Street. Next. Here's a gigantic bomb here. So they would ship these over to Douglas and across the line, and they'd be dropped on the combatants in Mexico, courtesy of Bisbee, Arizona. Next. And that ends my little talk on Bisbee Noir, but I would just like to show a couple slides from the book I'm working on. Next. In a chapter called The Wanderers, I talk about people who came through Cochise County of interest. And this was Lawrence Brown. This young man is 17 years old, and he flew this biplane as a two-seater. So the Mexican officers would sit in the back and either fly over and observe the troops going on, or he would drop those bombs out of this plane. One day, Lawrence Brown accepted his $500 monthly payment, and instead of getting in his airplane, he jumped on a passenger train out of Douglas and was never seen again. Next. This is one of my upcoming book, and this is also, this is Amelia Earhart landing in McNeil, and that's out there on the airport. She was taken to dinner by the McNeil Women's Club. Next. And one of my favorite characters, found west of Tombstone in 1898. He was naked except for what you see here. He was thrown in jail, and he eventually, 30 days in jail, but he started a newspaper column, and women from all over the country wrote to him. Okay, that's it. That's my new coming book, by the way. Thank you. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Tom. That was fantastic. Whereabouts on Main Street was the Orient? Alexis asks. They imagine it would have burned down, but what modern business would have been near?
Yeah, it did burn down. It was arson, actually. It's right, well, the Turf Saloon, which is on the south side of Main Street. It's almost directly across from it. I can't think of what that building is right across from that, but right across from what the old Turf Saloon on Main Street.
And Sharon asks, in the picture of the tug of war, she can see the building of the sign that says Bisbee Daily Review. Was that photo of the building the same location where the review office is now, below the library?
No. The review started out on Brewery Gulch, as you saw. Also, the Evening Oar started out there in the same place. It moved, I believe, to Main Street in about 1915. The building in which the review was in was a office for doctors, a sort of a clinic when it was originally built.
The next question, given the amount of drinking establishments in Bisbee, were there a lot of cases of violence occurring, fights, murders, etc.?
Well, there were cases of those, of course. Probably daily you would have a fight. Murders, not so much. And obviously the saloon owners didn't want the violence going on in their saloons. They were running a business. They had a difficult enough time, paying off vendors for alcohol and getting their tables and all that. But there were fights, and maybe on a daily basis you might find, or at least a weekly basis, a fight but the police officers were located at the mouth of Brewery Gulch and were quick to quell any violence that was happening. So there were murders, not a lot of them, but there were some, and there were fights also.
And did all the saloons have ladies of the evening working in their establishments? And if not, where were their places of business?
No, the very first city ordinance banned women from saloons for that very reason. And before that, women were not really allowed in saloons in Bisbee at all. And there was a red light district. It's about, well, I don't know, half a mile up Brewery Gulch is the red light district. You can still see remnants of that today. But there was a strict area there for the red light district. and they were not allowed in the. Okay, let me go back and also say there were 3 saloon districts. There was the main, by city council decree, there was Main Street, Brewery Gulch, and the Red Light District. And so they had 3 distinct districts. The women of the night were not allowed in any other part of town.
And what motivations / who drove the prohibition efforts? It sounds as though there was a real disdain for saloons and drinking in general.
Well, it was a combination. It was a reform era. And by 1915, women had the right to vote. There were suffragettes, so on. So that was part of it. The unions didn't like drinking either, because you certainly didn't want to go on strike and have drunken workers. So there's a combination of those and reform-minded men. By the way, it was all men at that point prior to, well, excuse me, going back 1912, it was all men that brought in suffragettes, but prohibition was a combination of these various groups: women's groups, unions, and reform-minded politicians.
And John asks, in 1917, there was a pool hall and tobacco shop inside of the Stock Exchange building. It was called H.S. Hillman, and his grandfather worked there as a young man and wondered if you knew anything about the establishment.
No. Short answer is no. I may have heard of it. That's it.
And you had mentioned that the mining company did not want drunken workers operating machinery and working inside of the mines the next day. Do you know if Dr. Douglas put forth any efforts to curtail drunkenness within the mining camp?
It's possible. I don't know specifically, but he did like to direct people in other directions in terms of plays, theater, sporting events, and so on. So he didn't actually, bring about prohibition or anything. Of course, he was gone by that time anyway. But he did try to direct the miners into other activities.
Oh, Tom, this has been such a fantastic presentation. Thank you so much for sharing your time and knowledge with our audience.
All right. Well, thank you. I was enjoying being here. And thanks to the Bisbee Mining Historical Museum for being in Bisbee.
And thanks to our audience also for joining us today. I hope you all will join us again on October 5th for our next online program. Until then, take care, everyone. Bye.